A practical accountant married for stability, then met the one she couldn't forget. The rhythmic clacking of a mechanical keyboard echoed through the home office. Outside, the Chicago wind battered the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the temperature was a perfectly regulated 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Under the sterile glow of the monitor, columns of tax data marched across Sarah Lynn's spreadsheets in unquestionable order. As a senior accountant, order was her religion. Her life was flawlessly formatted, enviable to the outside world, yet devoid of messiness and warmth. Over dinner earlier that evening, Sarah and her husband, David, had sat in polite silence. David, a renowned architect, adjusted his water glass, sliding it 2 inches to the left to align perfectly with his placemat. He did not look up as he cut a precise square of his steak. Sarah watched him. His hair was perfectly parted, his shirt immaculately pressed. He engineered their smart home's climate, remembered her dental appointments, and knew her favorite mug. Yet, his attention felt like the operation of a machine. He confused providing structure with providing presence. "A beautiful house is not about how big it is, Sarah," David said, finally looking at her. "It is about everything being in its exact, designated place. Do you agree?" Sarah forced a practiced smile. "Yes, David, I understand." She thought to herself, "In accounting, every ledger must balance. But sitting across from my husband, I realized the truth. We were not building a life together. We were just meticulously keeping a record of the empty spaces." The silence shattered as Sarah's phone vibrated violently. An unknown number flashed, followed by a voicemail icon. Sarah stopped typing, picked up the phone, and pressed play. Static hissed. Then, a heavy, ragged intake of breath. Sarah. Her hand tightened around the phone. The voice was raspy, stripped of vitality, but that hesitant cadence hit her chest like a physical blow. "Ethan." "It is me," the voice continued, breaking into a dry cough. "You do not need to call back, truly. I do not know who else to call. I have some things to arrange. And, Sarah, I am running out of time." A harsh beep ended the message. Sarah stopped breathing. A memory crashed into her mind, a cramped studio smelling of turpentine and rain. Ethan, his paint-stained hands wrapping around her waist while she cried over her CPA exams, his heartbeat against her back. The memory felt violently alive. Another emergency for a VIP client. Sarah flinched. David stood in the doorway, his posture as rigid as the concrete columns he designed. "You are up very late," he noted, his eyes darting to her screen. "Is there a problem?" In the reflection of the glass window, Sarah's face looked fractured, split into 2 different women. She placed her palm flat over the phone, hiding it. "No problem," Sarah said, her voice flat, locking her emotions into a mental vault. "Just a minor discrepancy in the numbers. I am handling it." David nodded, satisfied. "Do not stay up too late. It disrupts your routine." He turned and walked away, leaving Sarah frozen in the dark, with the first fatal miscalculation of her perfect life. Rain battered the frosted glass windows of a cramped West Chicago apartment. Sarah stood in the narrow hallway, her trench coat perfectly pressed, looking entirely out of place. A child's worn winter coat hung on a peg by the door. Inside the tiny kitchen, watercolor paintings were taped to an old refrigerator. A plastic medication organizer sat directly next to a box of colorful crayons. Sarah had come with a singular, active goal: listen politely, then walk away. She knew this was dangerous territory. Ethan emerged from the hallway, and Sarah's breath hitched. He was painfully thin, his skin carrying a sickly pallor. His signature messy hair was cropped close to his scalp due to intense medical treatments. He didn't act dramatic or solicit pity. He even offered a weak, self-deprecating smile. "I know," Ethan said softly, leaning against the counter. "I look like a defective version of myself." The initial conversation was strained. Ethan didn't beg for a second chance or bring up romantic memories. He went straight to the harsh reality. "The cancer is back. "Stage 4, he said, his voice flat. "They're giving me a few months. I have a mountain of medical debt, disorganized legal documents, and an 8-year-old daughter named Lucy. I need to set up a small trust fund, or at least organize this mess so she doesn't inherit a disaster when I'm gone." Sarah stared at him, stunned. This wasn't a desperate plea from a former lover. It was the final act of a dying father trying to clean up his life. "I didn't call you because I thought you still loved me," Ethan said with brutal honesty. "I called because you're the only person I know who can look at this pile of papers and not run away." Sarah's professional armor snapped into place. Her voice turned to ice. "You have lawyers, Ethan. Hospital administrators. Social services." Ethan offered a dry laugh. "Yes, and I also have 3 past-due eviction notices with my last name spelled completely wrong." Sarah stood up, ready to leave. Just then, a young girl walked out from the bedroom, clutching a box of colored pencils. She stopped abruptly when she saw the stranger. "Lucy, this is Sarah, an old friend of mine." Lucy looked up, her expression far too mature for her age. "Hello." Sarah's trained eyes catalogued the details. Lucy's sneakers were a size too small. Her cardigan was frayed at the elbows. Yet her hair was meticulously braided, a father's clumsy but devoted effort. Suddenly, Ethan doubled over in a rattling coughing fit. He tried to hide his face out of embarrassment. Without hesitation, Lucy stepped forward and handed him a glass of water. "Drink slowly, Dad," the 8-year-old instructed calmly. "Do not do it like last night." That single quiet instruction pierced Sarah's chest harder than any emotional plea. Sarah left the apartment shortly after, escaping the suffocating reality. She reached her luxury sedan and opened the battered folder Ethan had forced into her hands. It was a total disaster of overdue bills, denied insurance claims, and a stained rental agreement. But tucked between the red-inked demands for money was a crumpled paper, a child's crude crayon drawing. At the top, in uneven letters, it read, "Dad, do not forget Tuesday is my reading day." Sarah stared at the drawing. She sat perfectly still. Then she started the engine. The dashboard illuminated, cold and precise. A second later, she turned the engine off. It was the first truly active, uncalculated choice she had made in a decade. Sarah marched back upstairs and stepped into the apartment. Ethan was still at the table, exhausted. She slammed the folder onto the wooden surface. "Listen to me," Sarah commanded. "I am not doing this for you. For who then? Because this pile of paperwork is a complete insult to my professional principles," Sarah stated coldly. She looked him dead in the eyes. "There are people who ruin their lives out of selfishness, and you ruined yours because you kept thinking you still had time to fix it." For the first time in 10 years, Ethan let out a genuine, breathless laugh. By day, Sarah navigated a world of Italian marble showrooms, sleek boardrooms, and high-yield portfolios. By night, her reality shifted to the flickering fluorescent lights of a high-muy-bon-hour copy shop, depressing hospital billing departments, and the cramped kitchen of Ethan's apartment. She approached Ethan's chaotic finances like a hostile corporate takeover. She badgered insurance adjusters, negotiated down predatory medical bills, and hunted through years of old emails to collect unpaid invoices from his freelance gigs. She even cornered a budget-friendly attorney into drafting a bare-bones trust for Lucy. The deeper she dug, the more she witnessed the unvarnished truth of their lives. She watched Ethan cook 50-cent instant noodles, yet meticulously plate Lucy's portion like a restaurant meal. She noticed them quietly rotating the apartment's single heavy winter blanket between their beds depending on the cold. Ethan frequently forgot to eat, but never forgot to sign Lucy's school reading log. One evening, Sarah spotted a repurposed glass jar on the counter. Masking tape read, "For Dad's soup money." Inside was a meager collection of dimes and nickels Lucy had saved from recycled cans. A few nights later, Sarah let herself in with a spare key. Ethan was passed out at the kitchen table, his glasses skewed, gripping a past-due utility bill. On the floor, Lucy colored with deliberate, unnatural stillness so she wouldn't wake him. Lucy looked up, her voice a fragile whisper. "Miss Sarah, when grown-ups get too tired, do they hate the people who need them?" Sarah stopped taking off her coat. "Why would you ask that, Lucy?" "Because Dad apologizes to me so much," the 8-year-old said, eyes fixed on her book. "I think he feels like I bother him." Sarah looked at Ethan's exhausted face, then back at the girl. "No, sweetie. Your dad is just afraid he is not doing a good enough job." Lucy pressed a blue crayon hard into the paper. "I do not need him to be good. I just need him to be here." The words slid into Sarah's chest like a needle. But Sarah also saw the ugly side of Ethan's impulsivity. Digging through the files, she discovered he missed a critical insurance enrollment window simply by avoiding his mail. She found out that post-divorce, a deep depression cost him his job, forcing him to send Lucy to live with an aunt for 4 months. He was not a perfect victim. He was a flawed man paying the ultimate price for living entirely by emotion. "If I had married you back then," Sarah said plainly one evening, sorting receipts, "we probably would have completely destroyed each other." Ethan didn't look up from his sketchpad. "Yeah, highly likely." Sarah paused. "You admit that so easily." Ethan finally looked at her, his eyes soft but incredibly tired. "Because this time, Sarah, I do not need to win against you." It was a profound realization. Ethan was not her missed destiny. He was just a real, flawed human being. Meanwhile, the flawless architecture of Sarah's own life began to crack. David noticed the shifts. Sarah stared blankly into her wineglass during expensive dinners. She skipped appointments for their kitchen remodel. She was up at high, home AM, but her corporate VPN was not connected. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday morning. David stood in the kitchen, holding a bank statement. $5,000, the exact deposit for their imported kitchen stone, a symbol of upgrading their home, was gone. "What did you use this for?" David asked, his voice deathly calm. Sarah did not miss a beat. "A VIP client had a sudden tax liability risk. I advanced it to lock down a legal loophole before the deadline." David stared, his eyes searching her face longer than usual. "You have never used our joint account without telling me. Do I need to report every transaction to you now, David?" Sarah countered, her tone defensively sharp. "I am only asking, and I am only answering." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, a lie had created a tangible structural fracture in their marriage. The clinking of crystal flutes masked the stifling reality of the architectural gala. Bathed in the ballroom's amber glow, David moved through elite developers with effortless grace. Sarah stood beside him, the perfect corporate wife in a tailored gown. Across the city, the only light came from a cheap desk lamp. Lucy sat at a scratched kitchen table, tracing a library book, trying to ignore the ragged sounds of her father breathing heavily on the sofa. At the gala, an old friend raised his glass to David and Sarah. "Seeing you two after all these years, you are so solid. Effortless, really." Sarah gripped her clutch until her knuckles turned white, fighting a bitter laugh at the word effortless. Later, David took the microphone to present his firm's upcoming high-rise, a good architectural structure. He explained to the crowd, "Bears immense load without anyone ever seeing it. The strength lies hidden beneath the surface." The words lodged in Sarah's throat. Their entire marriage was built on that exact principle, skilled at bearing the weight of expectations. But no one ever bothered to ask if the people trapped inside were still alive. Suddenly, her phone vibrated, a sharp burst. She ignored it, but it buzzed again. Stepping into the shadows, Sarah checked the screen. It was a text from Lucy. "Miss Sarah, my dad is sleeping but breathing weird. I am calling you because I do not know if I should call 911. Sarah froze. The ballroom's lively chatter faded into a dull hum. A terrified 8-year-old girl had reached out to the only adult she thought could fix her world. "Excuse me," Sarah whispered, abruptly turning toward the exit. David noticed and followed her out the double doors. In the quiet, carpeted hallway, Sarah initiated a video call to Lucy. The screen shook violently in the young girl's hands. Lucy was pale, tears brimming in her eyes. "I am sorry for bothering you," Lucy sobbed softly. "Dad said not to call anyone, but he is really cold and he will not wake up." Sarah's voice dropped into an unnervingly calm register. "Listen to me, Lucy. Hang up and dial Chincham remote right now. Unlock the front door. Find the blue insurance card in his backpack. Put a blanket over him, but do not give him water. Understand?" Lucy nodded rapidly. "Okay." The call ended. Sarah turned around. David stood less than 10 feet away, his face rigid with shock. He had heard everything. He didn't know who Ethan was, but he knew his meticulously predictable wife was managing a life-or-death crisis involving a hidden child. Sarah bypassed him, rushing toward the exit. "Sarah," David's voice rang out, sharp and demanding. "Who is that?" Sarah stopped walking. For a brief, agonizing second, silence stretched between them. She did not turn around. "Someone who does not have the time to wait for me to explain," she said. She pushed through the revolving doors into the freezing Chicago rain. David had always believed that glass walls were the ultimate symbol of honesty, but it turned out the most transparent thing in their house was the distance between them. The emergency room was a sensory assault of buzzing fluorescent lights and the sharp squeak of gurney wheels against cheap linoleum. Sarah pushed through the sliding doors, her elegant evening gown starkly out of place in a room thick with sterile panic. She spotted Lucy immediately. The 8-year-old was sitting alone on a hard plastic chair next to a humming vending machine. She was clutching her backpack and her cardboard box of crayons to her chest, her small legs dangling above the floor. She was trying so hard to look brave that it was heartbreaking. Sarah rushed over, dropping to her knees so they were eye to level. "You did the right thing, Lucy," Sarah said, her voice steady and firm. Lucy nodded slowly, but her chin trembled. "If I called earlier, would it be different?" The child's question was a blunt, devastating strike to the heart. "No," Sarah answered, placing a hand over Lucy's small, cold fingers. "It is not your fault. No child should ever have to know how to save an adult." Lucy fell quiet for a long time, staring down at her worn sneakers. "Dad always apologizes to me. I am just scared that this time he will apologize, and then he will not wake up." The confession hollowed Sarah out completely. She stood up, walking to the triage desk. A nurse handed her a clipboard. Sarah stared at the line labeled "Emergency Contact." Her hand shook slightly as she signed her name, not out of lingering romantic devotion, but crushed under the weight of a profound, inescapable human duty. 30 minutes later, Ethan was stabilized. Sarah walked into his room. The heart monitor beeped in a slow, tired rhythm. Ethan drifted between consciousness and exhaustion. When he opened his eyes and saw her standing there in a designer dress, he grimaced. "Do not look at me like that," Ethan muttered, his voice barely a rasp. "I hate hospitals." "You hate everything with a standard form," Sarah replied dryly, pulling a chair to his bedside. "But I love them." "No, I just know what to do when there is a form." They did not speak of love, nor did they reminisce about the past. They spoke of the urgent, messy, unfinished business of a dying man. Ethan listed off the inventory of his unsold paintings. He gave her the contact information for Lucy's aunt in Milwaukee. He rattled off his email passwords, reminded her about Lucy's 3rd-grade reading assignment, and specifically asked her to make sure Lucy did not lose her crayon box. "I do not need you to forgive the past, Sarah," Ethan said, the monitor tracking his labored breathing. "I just need you to help me not disappear as a complete mess." Sarah looked at him, her corporate armor entirely stripped away. "Do you think I am doing this because of the past?" Ethan offered a weak, tired smile. "No, I think you are doing it because if you did not, you would hate yourself." The monitor's rhythm slowed as the painkillers took effect, pulling Ethan back into a deep sleep. Sarah quietly stepped out of the room. Lucy was waiting in the hallway. As Sarah sat down on the plastic chair beside her, the little girl reached out and tugged gently on the sleeve of Sarah's expensive coat. "Miss Sarah?" Lucy whispered. "Could you please not leave my dad alone when he wakes up?" Sarah looked down at the child. "I am scared he will think there is no one here," Lucy added softly. That sentence severed the last remaining tie Sarah had to her safe, unaccountable life. She wrapped her arm around the girl, pulling her close. Exhausted from the terror of the night, Lucy rested her head on Sarah's shoulder and closed her eyes. A moment later, a shadow fell over them. Sarah looked up. David was standing on the other side of the glass partition. His tailored suit was ruined, his trench coat soaked from the Chicago rain. He did not cause a scene. He did not scream or demand answers. He just stood there in absolute silence, taking in the devastating tableau. His meticulously organized wife sitting outside an intensive care unit, guarding a dying man, while a strange child slept heavily on her shoulder. Sarah gently shifted Lucy's weight, stood up, and walked out to the main corridor to face him. There was no room left for pretending. David looked at her for a long, agonizing minute. His voice was dangerously quiet. "So," David said, his eyes flicking toward the glass doors of the ICU. "This is the tax liability you had to resolve in the middle of the night." Sarah looked her husband directly in the eyes. She did not deny it. It was nearly 3 in the morning. The sprawling living room was swallowed in shadows, illuminated only by the cold Chicago skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sarah and David sat at opposite ends of the designer sofa. The physical distance between them had never looked more intentional. There was no screaming, no shattered glass. Instead, it was the devastating, quiet collapse of a decade-long facade. David's posture was stripped of its usual architectural rigidity. He simply asked for the truth. In the heavy silence, Sarah gave it to him. She laid out the entire reality. Ethan's terminal diagnosis, the desperate financial ruin, the terrified 8-year-old girl, the embezzled deposit money, and the suffocating realization that her own life had become a sterile void. She confessed to the lies and the profound disconnect within their home. Sarah braced herself, expecting the cliché question of a betrayed husband asking if she was sleeping with her ex. Instead, "How long have you been like this?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, away from me, away from yourself." Sarah sat frozen. The question pierced her corporate armor. From the other end of the sofa, David finally revealed the depths hidden behind his meticulous blueprints. He looked down at his hands. "My father disappeared and returned so many times I lost count," David said, his voice hollow. "My mother would break every plate, scream until her throat bled, forgive him, and the cycle would restart. My childhood home was an unpredictable battlefield." David looked up, his eyes meeting hers with unprecedented vulnerability. "I made a vow when I was a boy. I swore to build a life with absolutely no surprises, no loss of control, no scenes where people humiliate each other over uncontrolled emotions." He swallowed hard. "I am not cold, Sarah. I just thought order was the safest way to love." Sarah closed her eyes. The tragic misunderstanding of their entire marriage laid bare. "But I do not need an earthquake-proof building," Sarah answered slowly, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I need a husband." David flinched, unable to deny it. The conversation drifted deeper. Sarah admitted she no longer knew who she was outside of her spreadsheets. She clarified she hadn't betrayed David with her body, but confessed something far worse. She had betrayed their marriage through a decade of cowardly silence. David rubbed his face. "Do you still love him?" It was the hardest question of the night. Sarah didn't look away. "I do not know if what I feel for Ethan right now is still love," Sarah said with brutal honesty. "Maybe part of it is grief, part of it is guilt, part of it is a memory of the person I could have become." "And with me?" David asked. "With you." Sarah let out a trembling breath. "I stopped knocking a long time ago, and I think you did too." David stood up, walking to the massive window to look out at the freezing city. He stood as a dark silhouette against the urban glow. Finally, he turned back around. "Tomorrow," David said, his voice hardening into an ultimatum. "Either you end this, or I will be the one moving out." Sarah possessed a calm that bordered on physical pain. It was the moment she actively stepped into her ethical choice. "I am not sleeping with him, David," Sarah said, her voice piercing the silence. "My heart hurts not because of love, but because of jealousy." David froze. "I am jealous," Sarah continued, her words landing like heavy stones, "because a dying man like Ethan still knows how to love his child. He apologizes when he scares her. He cooks terrible dinners, but he is actually there. And us. We live in a house so beautiful no one dares to breathe too hard." David opened his mouth, but no words came. "If you want to move out tomorrow, I understand," Sarah said resolutely. "But I will not abandon a child just to preserve the image of this marriage." She stood up, the distance between them feeling absolute. "You built me a life with no risks," Sarah said quietly, looking at the man she married. "But David, zero risk does not mean zero pain." Sarah did not return to the sterile rhythm of her old life. Despite David's ultimatum, she continued to show up at the cramped West Chicago apartment. Her conscience was finally clear. She knew she was actively gambling her marriage, but for the first time, it was a transparent choice. Ethan deteriorated rapidly. The decline was uncinematic and brutal. Sarah watched him fall asleep mid-stroke while coloring on the floor with Lucy. She had to intervene when he stared blankly at his pill organizers, mixing up his painkillers. She listened quietly from the kitchen as he made his daughter recite emergency phone numbers over and over until she memorized them. One evening, Sarah walked in to find Ethan leaning heavily against the back of the sofa, clumsily trying to teach Lucy how to fold a sweater. His hands shook violently, making a mess of the fabric. "You do it badly, Dad," Lucy observed quietly. Ethan let out a weak, exhausted laugh, resting his forehead against the couch. "Yeah, but I want you to know I tried." Lucy stepped forward and wrapped her small arms tightly around his waist. "I do not need you to make it look nice. I just need you to not disappear when I turn around." Ethan went completely still, his eyes closing in silent devastation. A few days later, Ethan handed Sarah a battered, spiral-bound notebook. She opened it, bracing herself for a cliché love letter or a final romantic confession. Instead, it was an exhaustive, messy ledger of a child's life. It contained medication schedules, remaining debts, and lists of things Lucy loved and feared. There were frantic records of her highest fevers, the date she first tied her own hair, and the exact lyrics to her favorite bedtime song. Scattered in the margins were brief, entirely unsentimental notes addressed directly to Sarah. Sarah will know how to fix this spreadsheet. If Lucy cries, do not soothe her with candy. Do not let her think the silence is her fault. Ethan passed away shortly after. He went quietly, without fanfare. The funeral was held on a gray, biting Chicago afternoon. The wind whipped through the small, sparse gathering at the cemetery. Sarah stood far at the periphery. She refused to make herself the center of the tragedy. Her gaze remained firmly fixed on Lucy, who stood bravely holding her aunt's hand, a few of Ethan's small watercolor paintings propped gently against the floral arrangements. Suddenly, the shadow of a large black umbrella fell over Sarah, shielding her from the freezing drizzle. David stepped up beside her. He did not undergo a miraculous, overnight emotional transformation. He simply stood next to her in the biting cold. Slowly, he reached into his tailored overcoat and pulled out Ethan's battered notebook. Sarah had accidentally left it on the kitchen counter that morning. He held it out to her. Sarah stared at the worn pages, then at her husband's impassive face. Believing he had come to finalize the terms of their separation, she slowly began to slide her diamond wedding ring off her finger. "You were right, David," Sarah said, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "We cannot go back to the way things were." David reached out. His fingers brushed hers, gently but firmly pushing her hand back, stopping the ring from slipping past her knuckle. He did not offer a grand romantic speech. He did not demand immediate reconciliation. He simply looked straight ahead at the small coffin, his jaw tight. "I read the notebook," David said, his voice incredibly restrained, cracking just a fraction. "And, for the first time, Sarah, I understand that you were suffocating. It was not a promise of full absolution." But for the first time in their entire marriage, David truly saw the woman standing beside him. 1 year later, they sat on a neutral gray sofa in a marriage counselor's office. The silences were still heavy on some days. There were moments when Sarah's trust faltered, and David's instinct was to retreat behind a defensive wall. But for the first time in a decade, they had stopped pretending the structure was flawless. "When did the loneliness begin?" the therapist asked quietly. Sarah traced the lines on her palms. "It was not when he forgot an anniversary or missed a dinner," she said steadily. "It was the day I realized I no longer expected him to ask how I felt." David shifted. His architectural instinct urged him to defend, to correct the narrative. But he stopped. He leaned back and simply listened. It was the most profound change he had ever made. A few months later, the internal changes became physical. In Sarah's office, David stood on a stepladder, ripping down a massive panel of sterile, frosted glass. In its place, he painted the drywall a warm, imperfect cream. He installed a heavy oak bookshelf and an amber reading lamp. He stepped down, wiping dust from his jeans, and looked at Sarah in the doorway. He didn't hand her an unalterable blueprint. "Do you want to use this room to work?" David asked hesitantly. "Or to live?" Sarah walked in and placed a framed crayon drawing on the shelf. It depicted a crooked house and 3 stick figures under an umbrella. At the bottom, misspelled handwriting read, "People stay when it rains." Lucy lived with her aunt in Milwaukee now. It was not a fairy tale adoption, but a quiet bond between 2 people who had survived the same storm. That evening, Sarah's laptop chimed with a video call. Lucy's face filled the screen. "Miss Sarah," Lucy pouted, holding up a mangled, unevenly folded sweater. "My aunt says I still fold clothes really badly." Sarah smiled with genuine warmth. "Your dad did too, sweetie." Lucy fell quiet, looking at the sweater. "Yeah, but my dad always came back to try again." The child's words turned a final key in Sarah's chest. Later that night, Sarah walked into their kitchen. It was an active demolition zone, dusty and chaotic. The glossy marble was gone, replaced by exposed brick and raw wiring. David stood by the gutted island, staring at a torn-down wall. Sarah walked up beside him. She touched her diamond wedding ring. Instead of taking it off, she pushed it firmly down to the base of her finger. "You are incredibly good at designing houses, David," Sarah said softly into the dusty air. "But you completely forgot how to repair the cracks." "Maybe because I always thought a crack was a failure," David replied. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes clear and unguarded amidst the ruin of their kitchen. "Now I think it is the exact place we have to start. A perfect balance sheet never has a miscalculation, but human beings are different. Sometimes you have to accept the total bankruptcy of your safe illusions to finally realize what is truly a priceless asset. Sometimes the cracks in our lives aren't signs of failure. They are simply the places where the truth finally breaks through. Have you ever had to dismantle a perfect illusion to find your own reality? What did you think of Sarah and David's choice to stay and rebuild from the ruins? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. We read every single one of them. If this journey resonated with you, please leave a like and share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. For more deep, emotionally grounded tales of the human heart, make sure to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. Thank you for watching. And until next time, don't be afraid of the rain. Stay true to yourself.